Hello. I'm reading a book by Jack Buckby. I'll leave a link in the description. And I'm hoping to interview him sooner or later, but I know I think he's moving house at the moment, so maybe he's a little busy at present. But the book itself has taken me a long time to read, not because it's difficult language, but because I kept having to go back to reread bits of it, because it's a very disturbing book. It shows how there's a certain strata of our society which is caught in an impossible trap, and that trap is being created and maintained by the upper classes. And he's talking not only about the British upper class, he's talking about America too. He knows quite a lot about both. I would recommend you trying that book. Okay, the important point that Buckby makes is that the far right is almost exclusively joined by working class people, and he goes on to the observation that the mainstream media never gives the working class point of view about anything. It's always middle class metropolitan. So I got to thinking about that and wondered why. For instance, I can speak for the MSM here in Britain. They concentrated during the 1960s and the 50s a little bit, but mostly the 60s and the 70s, on vilifying the upper classes and making fun of them. Oh, how we laughed. Then in the 90s, they started work on the lower classes. There was Harry Enfield's Wayne and Waynetta Slob, for instance, and then Little Britain, which I honestly couldn't bear to watch. And in the US, I believe you have characters like Trailer Trash Tammy, and you've got other lower class characters that you make fun of, even down to, that thing in Friends, the naked man we never saw, but we can assume he wasn't exactly middle class. And as we know, back to Britain, those abuse gangs. I'm sorry about the circumlocution, but I'm trying to get this past YouTube again. Those abuse gangs were targeting working class kids only, and not just white, by the way, but Sikh too, but working class. So nobody cared about the horrors that were being perpetrated on previously tight-knit and mutually supportive working class communities. So Buckby's right to say that the only voice they were left with were in groups that ended up on the far right, mostly. Groups that gave simple answers, and generally inaccurate ones, but they were simple and straightforward to complicated problems. I haven't quite finished the Buckby book, by the way, but so far it seems to me that his approach is that the left and the mainstream media are forcing dissenters into the far right category to justify their own woke ideals. And they're forcing these people into that category to solidify their own feelings of superiority. But actually, I think it might go further than that. You see, I think it could be deliberate, maybe not conscious, but deliberate. And it's being done as a means of establishing political power and control. So just before I carry on with that, I want to do a quick rundown of Western European society and the working classes. The peasants then, which became the working classes, have always been disregarded. Of course, that's taken for granted. And they were always at the receiving end of the law, and they were always subject to the strictest of social controls. Anatole France put it this way, notes, oh yeah, here we are. In his novel The Red Lily, which was published in 1917, he said, the law, in its majestic equality, forbids the rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal loaves of bread. Very succinctly put, Monsieur France. That's not his real name, by the way. That was a nom de plume, but that's something else. The middle classes have always been worried about controlling the undisciplined appetites of the lower orders. And that's where the idea of eugenics started, by the way. Now, the big problem was that in the 20th century, the uncontrolled masses got the vote, and the middle classes had to pretend that they thought that was a good idea. And then the lower classes started to think that they were equal to the middle and upper classes, and this really gave the middle classes a bit of a crisis of conscience. And when enough of the lower classes ditched the I know my place mentality, which could have been as late as the 1990s, yeah, it could have been as late as that. But whatever, when the lower classes lost their subservience to the superiority of the upper crust, then those who considered themselves the upper crust had to think of some other way to establish their hold on superiority. And so various experiments were tried. For instance, in the Soviet Union, where this started earlier, of course, and everyone was supposed to be equal by law, instead of having aristocracy, they just cooked up a system of party membership to sort out the wheat from the chaff. If you belonged to the party, then you got to buy better stuff at a discount in special shops. Certain jobs were open only to party members. Certain apartments could be rented only by party members, and they were generally with better amenities and in better areas. And there were other privileges and services available to party members and so on. And you couldn't join the party unless you jumped through a whole series of hoops, which ensured that the top echelons had a cohort of loyal servants and faithful workers who would provide a buffer between them and the lumpen proletariat. That's how communism dealt with the class problem. Now, as for Britain and the USA, there were actually several stratagems I've identified that the middle classes used to hang on to power. I'll concentrate on just two, and the first is, of course, the education system. Both in the UK and the USA, the state school systems were exploited by the middle classes who bought houses in more expensive areas and then made sure their local schools were the best. You know, they joined the PTAs because they had the time and they were more articulate, and they gave their children extra tutoring and everything, so the standard of the kids was higher in the classes generally. And now Britain did start off with a system of grammar schools which were intended to lift the more intelligent working classes up into the middle classes by providing the brighter ones with a better education. But those were abolished by our egalitarian Labour Party, who've done more to destroy the working classes than any other in history, I think, and like what the Democrats are now doing to the working classes in America as I speak. Anyway, the Labour Party shut down the grammar schools, I believe, in the mid-60s. And then Tony Blair administered the coup de grace by imposing fees on universities in the 1990s and expanding the universities so that they had to take everyone, and forcing the working classes into rubbish degrees, which would put them in debt for the rest of their lives. Job done. In the USA, it was broadly similar. The school system evolved to have better schools in certain areas where property prices were higher, and that kept out the riffraff there. They came up with the idea of busing, but I don't think that really lasted that long, did it? You'll have to tell me if I'm wrong there. Anyway, back to the UK. I believe that's why so many of the middle classes and the mainstream media, who like to think of themselves as upper middle class, I think, are so dismissive of the Michaela School, which is run by a remarkable person called Catherine Birbalsingh. And she founded an educational establishment that's proved that the grammar school type system actually works for disadvantaged children. And she's got nothing but contempt from the establishment in every way. And I'm not talking about the aristocrats, I'm talking about the middle classes. In the USA, there's an awful lot of middle class resistance to school vouchers, isn't there? And I suspect for the same reason, because stepping up educationally is a direct threat to the control of the underclasses. And now, as I said, education is just one part of a whole structure. I'll go into just one more element of this, and it's by far the most destructive one, of course, and that's the habit of the middle classes and the MSM of calling anyone in the working class who speaks out far right. When a working class person or organisation raises concern about the problems they're having with immigrants from less socially advanced countries, for instance, they're immediately, and one without even any further investigation of any sort, they're immediately branded far right, aren't they? And this is used as a means of denying them access to the public forum. It's said that it's because their views are unacceptable, but as a matter of fact, it's their class that's unacceptable. We saw that in the case of Tony Randall. Again, remember YouTube strictures. But a more recent and even more striking example actually can be found in the situation that developed in Canada recently. Truckers are decidedly working class, aren't they? And they had to be brought to heel somehow. At first, I was puzzled over why the Canadian government wasn't even trying to reach an accommodation. And they went straight into confrontation and arrests and vilification and name-calling. And it became obvious that they didn't want any sort of an accommodation because it wasn't about masks or vaccinations or anything at all like that. It was about bringing the lower classes to heel. Over here, I want to point out Nigel Farage, whom I can still talk about on YouTube without getting demonetised. He himself is from the middle classes, but he speaks up for the working classes. And so far as I know, he has pretty moderate political opinions, but he's constantly referred to as far right and held up by the MSM as a hate figure. So he gave the British working classes a voice, and that's why he's far right and a hate figure. And a voice is precisely not what the middle classes want the British people, the working class people, to have. So that's the way I look at an extrapolation on Jack Buckby's book, and also of the woke stuff that's going on now, because that is embraced specifically by middle class people who then call anyone who doesn't have their weird and odd, very strange ideas, who doesn't subscribe to them, they're far right, and therefore they're getting ready to deplatform them in one way or another. So we should watch out for that. I just made a video about some kids who glued themselves to a painting because they wanted to draw attention to no oil. Or so, well, if we did away with oil, we'd all freeze to death. We'd starve to death. I don't know which one would come first. It's summertime, so we'd starve before we froze. And the survivors would end up eating each other. So, but you see, if I don't subscribe to that, I immediately become far right, and then I can be deplatformed. Right, so I'm making the most of my voice right now. I am Granniopteryx. I'm to be found on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds. I let you know, I've had people telling me that they haven't had notification of my videos. Look, subscribe to Twitter, Gab or Parler, one of those, and at me, at Granniopteryx, because I always let you know when I've uploaded a video on one of those. It's the safest way of finding out. And please like this video, please share it, please subscribe. Yeah, you've probably already subscribed, but if you're on YouTube, it's worthwhile checking that that you really are subscribed. So do that, check that again. Okay, I think that's about it. Yeah, oh, and support the channel if you can. I always appreciate it. Right, till next time. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Granniopteryx design or Granbo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.granniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.